The 4 books of the Bible that are known as the gospel, which means good news, right? And it is good news. Those 4 books of the gospel are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of the writers in these gospels were tasked by God to give an account of Jesus' life and how he fulfilled God's purposes, how he fulfilled all the prophecies that were told about him, which is all, again, certainly good news. Now, some of the miracle stories that are told in these Gospels are told multiple times across the Gospels, but some are unique to maybe just one. However, each writer does give an account of the last week of Jesus' life, from Palm Sunday to his death. In fact, they give so much detail about this week that many of them, all of them, take at least a quarter of their entire writings to talk about this one week. But some of them even take almost half of their writings to talk about this one week. So from Palm Sunday to Easter, with the Last Supper and the death of Jesus on the cross, there are very important steps all along the way. This makes Holy Week a journey that encompasses a lot of emotions, right? Like goodness and fellowship, maybe some things to learn all along the way, but then the sadness and the heartache of Jesus dying on the cross, all the way to what we celebrate now. We're sitting here with smiles on our faces celebrating that Jesus is risen. So it's a lot of emotions, and with so much detail, so much that happened in this story in this one week, it's only right that we take time to read from beginning to end, taking significant time to spend at the table with Jesus, at the cross with the disciples, which, by the way, were mostly women. And may I just point out that they were not afraid to be there, right? John is the only disciple of the 12 that we know was there, but it was mostly women. Then to the borrowed tomb where they laid Jesus' body. All of these are critical parts of the narrative so that we can see the power of God and can absolutely know for 100% that Jesus rose from the dead. Each writer tells the story in his own unique way, but if we compare these versions one to another, we can discover how the gospel writers all answer the same question. In a world full of uncertainty, how we can be sure that the resurrection is real. In a world full of uncertainty, how can we be sure that the resurrection is real? But let's face it, the idea of a physical resurrection of a dead person back to life seems a little unreasonable to think about, right? Like it doesn't even seem possible. That doesn't happen every day, so it's not something that we expect. Yet we see that Lazarus, just a couple of days before Jesus went into Jerusalem, he was raised from the dead. But when I look at that story, I think, but Jesus raised him from the dead. And now in this story, it's like Jesus raises himself from the dead. And it's just all a little hard to comprehend. And when I think of Lazarus, I think, okay, that's hard enough to understand because he came out of his grave, still wrapped in the linens all the way up to his face, right? Comes out like a mummy in a horror film, if you would, right? But he's there and he's back to life. But now we're going through this with Jesus too. It's just a lot to take in. And many are far too skeptical to really believe that the resurrection actually happened. But as people of faith, we believe that not only did the resurrection happen, but that this is at the core of our entire conviction. Like this is our faith. This is why we're here. If we didn't have this one act, right, this one moment of time where Jesus rose from the dead, we would not have Christianity. This is the base of our faith. And maybe you're a little skeptical. Maybe sometimes we sit here and find it hard to believe too. So how do we get past that? How do we get past it and claim that the resurrection is real enough that we 100% believe it, but then that we also share that and we can tell people that it is real? I think it starts by reading the accounts, right? Like all 4 of them. Reading the gospel accounts and looking at how each writer answers that question, how can we be sure that the resurrection is real? There we not only find a way to believe that the resurrection is real, but we also discover that the power of the resurrection is still happening today. Today we're going to take a brief look at the 4 different gospels and their stories, and I'm not going to read them all to you, so that would just stay a little bit under a certain time. But I want to encourage you, maybe today, if you have a few hours between visiting with family, or tomorrow, as we call it, Easter Monday, maybe some of you will be off, but just sometime in the near future, please sit down and read these accounts. You don't have to read all 4 Gospels, but read each one of their accounts of this last week, and particularly Jesus raising from the dead. I can't go through all of those details in one morning, but I promise you it'll be worth it just to look through and compare them. So what I want to do is I'm going to read through each one, or not read through each one, but go through each one. And I'm going to start by reading to you Matthew's account of that morning so we can use that as a base as we read through the others or look through the others. Early Sunday morning, as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went out to visit the tomb. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it. His face shone like lightning, and his clothes was as white as snow. The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angel spoke to the women. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come see where his body was lying, and now go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Remember what I have told you." So Mary Magdalene and the other Mary knew what had happened because they were there. They saw Jesus die on the cross. So just a little more than 36 hours previously, he had died on that cross, was buried. So this was all very fresh in their minds. This wasn't something that happened weeks ago or months ago. This was literally hours ago, and the hurt and the pain is still there, very fresh. There would be no possible way for them to expect what they were about to have happen to them as they walked towards that tomb. An earthquake, an angel shining brightly like lightning, as white as snow, descending from heaven, a giant stone being rolled away. They were firsthand eyewitnesses to the greatest miracle in human history. They were the first to see the empty tomb. They were the first to hear the good news that Jesus was not in there, that Jesus had risen. Death had been defeated. Despair had turned into glory. However, notice that even though the women were experiencing this firsthand account, that they didn't quite live into that good news just yet. And we know this because the angel had to say to them, "Don't be afraid. Don't dwell on what all this quite means just yet. Don't be afraid." The angel recognizes that they have this fear. He recognizes that they have this anxiety. He acknowledges the fact that they don't understand this just yet, that they're not going to. And he tells them simply and directly that Jesus has been raised from the dead. He doesn't even attempt to explain how, right? Or help them understand why. No word about how a body had been dead for 36 hours and now all of a sudden had a heartbeat again or had a brainwave again, right? It's just that he is. The angel chose to say nothing about how the resurrection happened, but instead just tell them as clearly as possible that it did. This is what happened. Jesus is alive. And then he does this great thing. He invites them to go meet the risen Savior. We can easily get so caught up in bad news or more bad news that we end up missing the good news. That we're so dark, we're so lost in that darkness that we don't even pay attention to the good things that are happening around us. The reality is that God is resurrecting dead things to life all the time, all around us. For instance, every time somebody says yes to Jesus, they're resurrected into new life. Yet we are so locked in our fears and our anxieties that we miss it. The angel tells the women, don't just stand there trying to figure out what to make of this good news. If you do, you're going to miss it, right? You're going to miss it and you won't understand it anyway. So just get up, get moving, get going, and go meet the resurrected Messiah. I believe Matthew's advice in this letter, in his book here, is to be active. To literally be active. So if you're struggling with your prayer time, if you're struggling to even comprehend that this is going to work, that this is going to do anything, well, do it anyways. Pray anyways, over and over and over again about the same thing. Pray until you do believe it, and pray until you do see God at work in it. If you're straining, if you have a strained relationship with your Bible, if you're straining just to be able to sit down every day and read this, to understand it, or to read the whole thing, then just keep doing it every day. Keep reading the Bible. Keep reading it until you do believe it. And if you have a bittersweet relationship with the church, if the Christian community has hurt you in some way, and maybe you're reluctant to be participating with a church body and whatever that looks like, do it anyways. Come to the special events. Come to church, not just every now and then, but literally weekly. Come. In other words, live a life that counts on the resurrection until you believe it, right? Live a life that says, I am counting on this being the truth. That's exactly what the angel told the women to do. Count on it. Like this is the truth. So go to Galilee. You may still have anxiety. You may still have fear. You may still have lots of questions, and who in the world could blame them? But God is calling you to do something about it. So get active in your faith. Go meet the resurrected Jesus. Then in Mark, Matthew and Mark, their accounts are very similar. It's been that Mark was written first, and maybe Matthew took some things from Mark, and they kind of compared whatever. So this account is very similar, but there are some differences. For one, there's a third woman in Mark. Now, it's a small detail, but no one sees the stone rolled away in Mark. It's like it's already just been done. And I want to take note of that because when Mark is telling the story, he's saying it as a past tense, like it's already happened. And here's something else that's different between the two. Matthew and John, between three of them at least, Matthew and John each record a meeting between the women and Jesus. And it happened shortly after that they've been told that Jesus has resurrected. And the most famous account of this is in John, where Mary Magdalene thinks that Jesus is a gardener. But nothing like that happens in Mark's story. What we must know and remember is that the main purpose of the gospel writers was to give an account, an accurate account of Jesus' message, not to present it in chronological order, not to lay it out like that. I like to learn like that, so sometimes I like to use my chronological Bible because that does help, but that was not the purpose of these writings. The accounts are so clearly written, also by different perspectives, right? So Matthew and Mark were not there. It was the women. So they're getting the perspectives of the women and putting that into their writings. And there are places in the Gospels that the writers place certain accounts near to others to show particular points of Jesus' messages. For instance, in Mark's Gospel, the implication that Jesus has gone ahead of the women and they are to continue moving forward to meet him. Right? Like he's talking like there's something else so greater. The angel says, go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there just as he has told you. So in other words, God's power and presence have preceded the women in the act of rolling the stone away. That had already been done. But he's also gone before them now to Galilee. In one moment in time, at a place where the women came expecting to find death and expecting to find despair, they came to realize that not only was God there in the present moment with them as an angel's right in front of them, right? God is there, they know that, but he's also been in the past and he's also in the future. The power of the resurrection through Christ is the power to redeem the haunting guilt and shame of our yesterdays, the ongoing sufferings and despair of today, as well as the anxieties and the worries of tomorrow. This sounds a little bit like John Wesley's understanding of grace. If you know anything about that, he said it came really in 3 steps: prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. And prevenient grace basically is the grace that's always been there. Because Jesus already died on the cross, it's already there for us. It's there before we even recognize it, before we even know it. God has worked in our past in ways that we're not fully aware of. God has lured us into relationship with him, right? He's been calling us. He's been knocking on the door. He's always been there working in us. There's been times, maybe unexpected moments, where God has just dropped a little love your way or a little grace your way, or God has cared for you. In a sense, it's like he's already rolled away the stone, right? It's already happened. That's prevenient grace. Justifying grace is God working more in the present. The power of the resurrection leads us to utter humility and obedience to God to the point where we are left with no response but to say, okay, to respond and say, yes, I will surrender wholly to the one who has raised Jesus from the dead. We experience new life. This is justifying grace, or it's also known as saving grace. This is the moment when we say yes to God and he is now our Lord and our Savior. And then the third step is sanctifying grace. And sanctifying grace is God working on us into our future. God is molding you. He's shaping you. He's preparing you for the destiny that he desires for you. God will journey with you into the unknowns of tomorrow, showing you how your gifts and your abilities will contribute to the wider plan that he has for his kingdom. And his resurrection guarantees our future security. This is sanctifying grace, a grace that continues to grow you, a grace that continues to develop you and to work on you to grow into the person that God is calling you to be. John Wesley believed that the grace of God comes before us, that it goes before us, and that it lives in us still right here, right now. That's what the women at the tomb experienced firsthand The resurrection had happened. God was with them in that moment, and the resurrected Christ awaited them. Let's take a look here at Luke. So much of the opening of Luke's Easter story does resonate with the other two, with Matthew and Mark. The women show up to do their job, to do their due diligence, to anoint the body, to get them cleaned up, wrap them up in spices again because that wasn't done real well on the Friday before. But when they arrive at the tomb, the stone is rolled away. The two brightly dressed men were there standing to tell them, "Why are you looking among the dead? Who are you looking for? He isn't here, but he has been raised." And then, like in the other Gospels, the women react with understandable fear. And just when you're about to chalk up that Luke's Easter story is pretty much the same as the other two, Luke offers us a unique curveball to his version. The messenger tells the women, "He isn't here, he has risen from the dead." And then he adds this, "Remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again on the third day." So yeah, the women are afraid, they're perplexed, that's understandable. But according to Luke, do you hear what their real problem is? They're forgetful. Them and the disciples, the 11 that are still here, they are all forgetful. They should have remembered what Jesus had been telling them all along. All that they had ever needed to know to make sense of this moment, to face it with courage, had already been told to them. They just hadn't put it all together yet. That comes. But embracing the uncertainty of life and accepting the resurrection means that we also have to remember. Remember that God has been working in you, whether you realize it or not. He is always still working. He has not given up on you. And he has always given you everything that you need to embrace the eternal new life. Luke's message is inviting you to think back through some of the most significant moments of your life and remember. Does anybody here remember their baptisms? Maybe you were a baby and you don't, but does anybody remember your baptisms, right? And we did a remembering of your baptism last summer. So remembering that God has claimed you in that baptism. He is claiming you as his child. He is welcoming you into the family, and he is well pleased with you, right? We also can remember the times in our lives when maybe we feel like there's just something bigger out there than me, than my little existence. There's got to be something greater in the universe. And do you remember those moments when all seemed hopeless, but yet you could feel a tug on your heart, not letting you give up, making you move forward? Do you remember those moments? We all have those stories. I know you do, and that's again another reason why you're sitting here. God's grace has been at work in your entire life, and at this very moment, the Easter story is giving you the key to new life. Remember who God is, remember who you are to God, that you are his child, and remember what you already know about how you are to live. That ought to be the end of the story right there, right? Like that ought to just be enough to sum it up. Luke has already given us the big reveal, but Luke isn't done. For some reason, Luke has one more thing to say. The other Gospels reveal the names of the women at the beginning of their account, but Luke waits until this point to tell you the names of those women who were there. Luke says in 24:10, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them. So he lists them out, and I want to give you a little background about the first two of these women. Now, Mary Magdalene, and you may know this, but Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Before she met Jesus, she was full of demons, and she was a prostitute. She had an awful and ugly reputation, and she comes with an awful lot of baggage, right? But Jesus forgave her. Jesus gave her new life, so it was all completely washed away in Jesus' mind. Joanna is the wife of an employee of Herod. And if you know who Herod is in this story, he's one of the villains. Right? He's a Roman person. He is a Roman leader. He is a bad guy. He's one of the guys that helped push this all along for Jesus to be put to death. And her husband is an employee of that guy. And just makes me wonder, was she sneaking around even behind her husband to be here with Jesus? These women had scandal in their past. They came with baggage and their reputation, all reasons why no one should listen to them, that no one should believe anything that they have to say. And that's exactly what happened when the women ran back to the disciples. It says, their words struck the apostles as nonsense, and they didn't believe the women. Why? Was it just because they were women in a low society where women are known as all but nothing? Or is it just because this is too hard to believe? I don't think either one of those reasons. I think it has to go back because of the reputations of these two women, the two who were standing there telling them about this. Ultimately, Luke's Easter story is about competing memories. It's about making a choice between which set of memories that you're going to choose to claim today. Will you choose to remember all the reasons why your life isn't worthy of God's love, all the shame and guilt from your past, all those ways in which you are undeserving of the resurrection? Because if that's so, then you only see the resurrection as nonsense, just like the disciples did. Or will you choose to remember what God has been telling you all along? That you are a child of His, that you are worth it. Will you choose to remember the memories of God's love all throughout your life? Because if so, then on this day, your new life can start right here, right now. We can live in peace with Him. And let's take a look here at John's story, because this one's very important too. If you read John's gospel expecting to hear about the dramatic rising of Jesus with dazzling special effects like the stones rolled away and now there's this bright angel, there was a big earthquake, you're not going to get any of that. Not in John's story. Not even a little bit. Instead, John wants to build the suspense. This is almost like a good mystery novel or movie. He is building the suspense. He doesn't want to give away the ending or the climax just yet. He waits a little while. He brings Mary Magdalene into the scene as the first one to be surprised that the tomb is empty. She runs back. She gets some backup, Peter and John, and they come running to the tomb. One by one, they slowly peek inside. John then peels back the layers of evidence that the stone has been rolled away, the head linen has been folded and separated from the others, and then just when you think he's about to announce the news, nope, he delays again. This gospel story to me touches me in a little bit different way than the other ones do. And I think it's because this story in John's version John's purpose is more about being personal, relational. It's about a dialogue. It's about a conversation that happens. It's got this tender quality to it. Mary, who has just experienced the death of her teacher, of her friend, is standing outside the tomb. She's crying. And she comes to the conclusion that somebody has just had to have stolen his body, that Jesus' body's just gone. She has no idea where it is. And then she sees two angels inside the tomb. And they ask her why she's crying. Now, the previous accounts of angels immediately are saying, hey, he's risen. You don't need to cry. You don't need to be upset. But John doesn't tell us that just yet. And then what's more, someone who looks like a gardener appears. And he asked her the same question. Dear woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for? Right up here. And then listen to Mary's response. Sir, she said, if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him. Now, I imagine Mary's not much bigger than me, probably even smaller than me. And little Mary is going to go ahead and drag his body back to the tomb and take care of that. Here we are now 15 verses into John's Easter story. 15 verses, and still not a word about the resurrection. And Mary, maybe just like you, is waiting. She wants answers. She wants to know where he is. She's waiting. You may be waiting for God too. Maybe you're waiting for God to just puncture through like some big earthquake, right? Like some bright shining light with angels speaking nice and loud and clear. You're waiting for him to burst through your suffering to give you those answers. It was at that moment when Mary was at her lowest point. Lowest point. And then John does it. Then he says it's time. It's time to reveal the climax, 16 verses into the story. The news doesn't come with the sound of trumpets or with the sound of angels singing or anything like that. The news comes plainly. It comes in a very simple way, a very tender way from the mouth of Jesus, the gardener himself. And he says one word, Mary. And every time I hear this word and read this in Scripture, it gives me chills. Can you imagine Jesus just saying to your name, Mary? It's all he needed to say. He didn't say nothing else. And Mary knew exactly who he was. Maybe she was blinded by her tears prior to that. Maybe it was just the way Jesus needed this to be. But he says, Mary. And she gets it. She turned to him and she said, Rabbi, which means teacher. She wanted to wrap her arms around him, and he's like, hold on, not yet. Don't cling to me just yet. I know you love me, but don't cling to me just yet. If we listen closely, the same God who said, Mary, is whispering our name too. I hope and pray that you can hear it with clarity, that you can receive great joy because he's calling your name. The same God who first uttered your name at the moment of your birth, who then again at your baptism uttered your name. The same God calls out your name right now with confidence and resurrection power. You no longer need to wait for the light to come. Your Redeemer lives. Your Redeemer is here right now, and he is calling your name. Each of the gospel writers offer an answer to the question, to our uncertainties about the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew, the resurrection is found when we choose to live it, when we choose to practice it, when we choose to be active and follow God until we can fully believe it. Mark, the evidence of the resurrection is found in a way that God has worked in our past before we even realized it, in our present right here in front of our faces, and in our future when we have all these uncertainties and all these worries and unknowns, he's still working. And in Luke, the resurrection is found in remembrance. Choosing to remember who God is and what he's already done for you. And in John, the resurrection is found in hearing God speak your name. Your name, a personal call to you, and realizing that God is always with you, despite any uncertainties you have. Each of these Easter stories in the gospel calls for our response to the resurrection of Jesus. What's it going to be? Are we going to want to run and hug him just like Mary? Are we going to call out saying, I know who you are. I remember you. We have to give a response. What's it going to be?